Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. And thank you so much for our panelists for taking time out of everybody's busy lives to share your knowledge about ranked choice voting or elections in general. We really appreciate your taking the time. So just to kind of set the stage, the purpose of this meeting is so that the Charter Commission can get questions answered as part of our process to study and make a recommendation to the City Council about RCV. So this is a Q&A event. It's not a debate. So questions were submitted ahead of time from the Charter Commission members, and they were directed to specific individuals. So we'll be kind of rotating through so everybody has a chance to answer some of the questions. The panelists here tonight were selected by the Charter Commission. So we're super happy that we got so many people to agree to participate. There is no public comment this evening, just to let you know. We do invite those who are interested in making comments to the Charter Commission to attend the public listening session on March 6th at 6 p.m. in the council chambers. So we have a lot of questions to get through tonight, so we're going to do our best to get through all of them, but we also want to be very respectful of the time of both everyone in the audience as well as our panelists and our Charter Commission members. So we may not get to all of them, and if we do not, we'll discuss an opportunity to how we would approach the rest of the questions. If we do get through all of them and time allows, the Charter Commission members will be allowed to ask any additional questions they have at the end of the meeting. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And the best way to get started is to have everyone briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and about your elections experience. And so we'll just go straight down the line, starting with Loren.
Good evening. My name is Loren Botner. I've been in the city of St. Louis Park since approximately 2004. I've served as an election judge starting in approximately 2000, and that was in Edina. And then once I began living in St. Louis Park, I became engaged in caucus conventions, but also as an election judge. So I try and stay somewhat politically active.
Great.
Anything else?
That sounds great, unless you have anything to add.
That's fine.
All right, thanks. Deb?
I'm Deb Brinkman, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of St. Louis Park. I've lived in St. Louis Park for 31 years, and I have been an election judge here in St. Louis Park, not all that often, but when I can arrange my schedule as such, I certainly do that. I've been involved with the League of Women Voters for over 10 years. I've been the president of the League of Women Voters for about the last 8 years. And so knowing and understanding voter issues and what's important and how it impacts democracy and how it impacts everything in that, that we do has been it's been a very important issue for the League, and election reform in particular, one of the biggest efforts going on in the League of Women Voters. So that's why I'm so interested in this particular process.
Thank you. Jenny?
Hi, I'm Ginny Gelms. I'm the elections manager for Hennepin County. I have been an election administrator for 12 years. And my role at the county is we support the cities in their elections, administrative roles. We train city clerks and school district clerks. There are a number of other program areas that we have at the county, including we own the voting equipment, we program it, we do the ballot design, absentee voting. Before I was with the county, I worked at the city of Minneapolis as an elections technician, and later I was the acting elections director there. And I worked for them when the city of Minneapolis first implemented ranked choice voting in 2009. So I was the project lead on that project.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Hi, my name is David Schultz. I'm a professor of political science at Hamline University and a law professor at the University of Minnesota. Among the things I teach is election law. I've probably written more on election law than anybody should be allowed to write about in their life, and so I won't go through all that. I've also, I was the executive director and chair of Common Cause Minnesota for several years back in the 90s. And if it's relevant at all, I also have worked as a city director of code enforcement and pretty knowledgeable about city affairs. Back in 2009, before you took over, your predecessor asked me if I would write the first sort of evaluation and implementation analysis of Minneapolis's plan for ranked choice voting, and I've done a lot of work on evaluating ranked choice voting over the years. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm up next. I'm Mary Wickersham. I've been in St. Louis Park since 1978, so I've got a couple of you beat. I have been an election judge since 2002, and that was the year that Paul Wellstone passed away, so we had a very interesting election with write-in ballots. In my experience with St. Louis Park, I have participated in absentee voting. I've been a co-chair and then later a chair judge. And now I'm doing a variety of things, including healthcare facilities voting, working in a precinct, not as a chair anymore. And I've also helped coordinate student election judges with both high schools here in St. Louis Park. So I think that about covers it. Oh, I also was one of the early trainees in the SVRS system for St. Louis Park and also the e-poll book, which I really like.
Thanks, Mary. Jeanne?
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I'm Jeanne Massey. I'm the Executive Director of FairVote, Minnesota. We're the organization that promotes and educates Minnesota communities about the process of ranked choice voting. I have been the Executive Director for the past 11 years. I first came into this whole reform simply as a voter and observing how much dysfunction we're experiencing in our electoral process. Called FairVote Minnesota and got engaged in that process. And I led the campaign to bring ranked choice voting to Minneapolis, then became executive director and assisted the community of St. Paul and other cities explore the possibility of ranked choice voting. Through the past 10 years, I've also been deeply involved in the implementation process, both on the technical side and understanding and being a part of those conversations and helping build and implement education plans to make sure voters were familiar with that change, which is very important. I'm also an election judge. I really wanted to see how voters experienced a change like this on the other side, as well as voters experience in a traditional election year. So I've been an election judge for the past 5 years, and that experience has just deepened my understanding about the kind of educational needs a process like this really needs. I also spend quite a bit of my time sharing the knowledge and expertise that Minnesota has acquired around the process of ranked choice voting with other states and other cities across the country, and frequently appear on radio and TV and make sure that people are understanding the kind of experience Minneapolis and St. Paul have had around ranked choice voting.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Chris Tholkes, and my day job is I work for the State Health Department, so I have a great commitment to public service. And in that capacity, when I learned that we had election judge leave, so the ability that I didn't have to take vacation time, but I could get involved in the process through being an election judge, that was really intriguing to me. So I have lived in St. Paul and been an election judge since 2005, started as a precinct judge and then became assistant head judge. And then the last 3 years have been head judge. And then this last election in November, I took a week off and was deputy auditor and worked the early voting. So was at the Ramsey County Elections Office for the week prior to the election.
Great. Thank you all. We're just going to start kind of going back and forth and asking questions. We'll direct them to the specific panelists. So I'm going to leave it over to you since I technically asked the first question.
Are we going through these?
No, let's start down here. Yep.
Just so you know, my name is David Dyer. I'm the vice chair of the Charter Commission. And as Sarah said, we're just going to be swapping back and forth with the questions. And so I guess the best thing to do is just start from the top of our list. And the first question we have is for Ginny. And that is, has the voting equipment, I'm sorry, can everybody hear me? Has the voting equipment adapted well to RCV? And can you describe the steps in counting the ballots once the machines can no longer tabulate races?
So the voting equipment that we have in Hennepin County was not originally designed specifically for ranked choice voting, but we have been able to work with our vendor to work on basically workarounds so that it can handle ranked choice voting ballots, and it can do sort of a preliminary tabulation. I'll explain a little bit more about that, because you asked about what are the steps in counting the ballots. So what the ballot machines can produce is sort of a raw vote total of your first, second, and third choices, the number of first, second, and third choices that every candidate has received. That, depending on the rules that you would write into your charter, might be enough for you to be able to declare unofficial winners for any candidate who passes the threshold in the first round. So a candidate gets 50% or more of the vote off the bat. That would be enough information for you to go ahead and make that declaration, and you would have that information instantaneously on election night. Where it gets a little bit more cumbersome is where you have a race where the candidate does not meet that 50% threshold on election night. And what the information that you need in order to then do the actual ranked choice voting reallocation and tabulation is you need to know not just the number of first, second, and third choices that every candidate got, but how each individual ballot was marked, which candidates appeared in each ballot, and in what order. That information is not transmitted electronically to us on election night. So what the city of Minneapolis does is they get their memory sticks out of the voting equipment. They return those memory sticks to us on election night. We have to physically download that information. That is a data accumulation process that actually takes us all night. So we accumulate that data overnight, and then we prepare an Excel file for the city, which we give to them the next morning. And then the city takes that Excel file. Basically what's in the Excel file is each line represents a single ballot, and each column is the choice that the voters have made. So then the city takes that file, and their staff then do the tabulation. It is essentially a manual tabulation using that digital data. They cut and paste those lines in that file and use it to basically make little kind of digital piles of ballots in the Excel file, and that's how they figure out who the winners are.
Great, thank you. The next question is actually for both Loren and Mary, so you'll each get 3 minutes to respond. So if a switch to RCV was made in St. Louis Park, what are the possible challenges you as a judge might face in terms of being able to successfully administer an election?
Do you want me to go first?
You can start, Loren, thanks.
After giving that some thought and knowing the process we use for our voters, the first thing that would come to mind is, are the voters prepared for this change? The second step would be, as they move through the process of casting their ballot, our demonstration judges typically are there to indicate how to mark a ballot. But in this instance, I can perceive that they may receive questions that involve these multiple choices. And then after that, the process of a voter may be overvoting, making a mistake, that the time consumed for correcting that is nominal because of the equipment we have, the process we have. So I really don't perceive that as an issue. It's more, does the voter have enough information that they feel comfortable in marking their ballot for that choice?
Okay, you took 2 out of my 3 notes that I had. So I really agree with what you had to say. And the more time spent at the demonstration judge, I think is actually a good thing. I picture someone coming in for the first time under ranked choice voting, and being a demonstration judge, I would go, wait a minute, things have changed. You need to listen to me this year. Because I would say more than half of voters do not pay any attention at all to the demonstration judge. And those who appear to, maybe 80% of those are just being Minnesota nice. So I look forward to that, because I think voters would pay attention because they would be aware that something has changed. So that would be a good thing. I would also expect, in addition to the increased questions, increased comments. Anytime there's a change, we get some pros and cons from the voters, and that's not a bad thing. It gives the election judge an opportunity to interact with the voter, and that's a more personal experience, so I don't think of that as a bad thing. That was it.
Thank you.
This next question is for both Deb Brinkman and Jeanne Massey. The question is, how does RCV improve civility among candidates during the election cycle?
Okay, thank you. One of the biggest reasons that it improves civility is because candidates need to vie for their opponent's second and third place votes. So if I'm a candidate and I'm wanting to get somebody second or third place votes, I'm not going to spend my time cutting down my opponent, because that just, voters don't respond to that. So that's one of the biggest reasons. One of the other reasons is that candidates now will suddenly be campaigning to the majority. So now, rather than just doing their campaign to their base that they've already defined, they're speaking to all the voters. They're speaking to all the residents. And that's what's so powerful about it. So now, and they're talking a lot more about issues rather than just personality issues, personality distinctions. And so that is a much healthier way to make a decision about what we want our candidates to be working on. And then the third bullet I wrote down is that some of the negative campaigning that has been done has had the opposite happen. So it hasn't really helped the candidate. It has had negative consequences.
I'll only add to that point that what we know about ranked choice voting is that it's a shift in the culture of campaigning, as much for candidates as it is a learning process for voters. And we work with candidates to make sure that they understand that process. What we're told by candidates after they campaign under ranked choice voting is how much they enjoyed that change. They're fearful going in, many of them, admittedly, but they're very grateful afterwards because they get to talk to all of the voters. Candidates really run to serve, and they'd like to be able to talk to all of the voters. So what they don't like to do is knock on a door under the traditional system, and if a voter says, well, I'm really voting for somebody else, a candidate right now simply says, well, thank you for your time and goodbye. There's no reason to call that voter back. There's no reason to find out what that voter is interested in or cares about in the community. Under ranked choice voting, that candidate has a vote-getting reason to stay at the door, ask what that voter cares about, and ask for that voter's second choice. That's a powerful shift, and that's what Deb is referring to in terms of the candidates talking to all of the voters, and they like that change in the process. And they take office knowing that many more voters' interests in the community.
Thank you. The next question is for David Schultz. Based on your knowledge of elections and campaigns, would RCV benefit non-traditional candidates versus a non-RCV election, where the winner would only need the most votes to win?
One of the things that I think many people have come to realize, I'm going to call it since Florida 2000, is what's called the spoiler effect. And you might recall, for whatever reason it is, and we can have a great debate on it, lots of people will blame Ralph Nader, for the election returns that year. And I'll let you decide whether or not you like those returns, but we'll let it go as that. But the point is that a lot of times people might want to vote for, let's say, a non-traditional candidate. And what I mean by that, a third-party candidate, but fear that if they vote for that third-party candidate, their absolute worst fear will materialize, and the candidate who they like the least will wind up getting elected. And therefore, our current system, in terms of the first past the post system, which is what we use right now, creates a disincentive to vote for a spectrum of candidates beyond sort of the top two candidates who are already there, usually Democrat and Republican. And there's pretty good evidence out there that suggests that what ranked choice voting does is to really give people the incentive. It says that I can vote if I've got three candidates. If A is my real first choice candidate, I'm going to vote for my first choice candidate. And then I have an incentive to say, well, if my first choice doesn't win, I will go with my second choice, which would be B, and so forth like that. And not only does this sort of work out in theory, from a political science perspective, but we're actually seeing that not just in the few places that we have ranked choice voting in the United States, but if we look around the world where there's actually been uses of ranked choice voting, there is some an indication that it encourages that. It not only encourages, let us say, voters to be able to have be willing to take a larger risk in terms of voting for other candidates, but it also seems to encourage a lot of other candidates to run third-party candidates, and therefore it gives both the voters more opportunities to choose and a greater range of candidates from which to choose from.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. This next question is for Chris. As an election judge in St. Paul, what was your experience with voters using ranked choice voting in the last election?
Sure. So I worked the week of early voting, and I worked at the Ramsey County Elections Office, which has an incredible, diverse pool of voters. And I would say that the vast majority of folks, even though I had seen it all over the news and there had been a lot of education, most people didn't know that they were having ranked choice. Those folks that did come up and, as I'd start to explain what the change is, a lot of folks would say, yeah, I know it. But they didn't quite understand how to mark the ballot. They didn't understand that you could rank up to 6 choices. Everyone seemed to think that it stopped at 3 choices. So there was a lot of same day, of voting day education that still had to happen. We did have things, we had a handout for folks, as well as all of the judges being able to verbally explain and show people on the ballot. We had a lot of interpreters at my particular location, and so we had to do a lot of education with the interpreters to then be able to turn around and help the voters as well. And then I would say that the number one question that we got asked after doing our spiel about how to mark the ballot and what their choices were was, can I still just mark one? That was primarily what people wanted to know. Is it okay to just mark one? Or do I have to rank more than one?
I just had a quick follow-up question to that. You mentioned that there were a lot of people that weren't aware that RCV was the way the vote was. Is there anything you would say that would help better inform the public that the vote had changed?
I don't know. From my perspective of living in St. Paul and being a voter, I felt like the word got out pretty well, and people that knocked on my door did talk about it. So I'm not sure where the breakdown was for folks, but there were a significant number of people that showed up to the poll and were completely unaware. Like, do you know about the change? Do you know about ranked choice voting? And lots of people said no.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the next question is going to Ginny. Do election results take longer to tabulate and post in an RCV election? How long did this process take in 2017 in Minneapolis?
Yes, the results process takes longer than in a traditional election. In 2017, the city of Minneapolis was finished tabulation, I believe. So election day is the Tuesday. I believe they were finished by end of day on Wednesday. And that was an improvement from what they had done 4 years prior. I think it took them until the end of the week. They were finished by end of day Friday. And they had, that 2017 was their 3rd RCV election. They've had lessons learned after each one and done some process improvements and also some ordinance and charter changes to make their rules a little bit more conducive to faster counting.
Thank you.
The next question is another one for both Loren and Mary. And this question is, what challenges do voters currently face in understanding our current election system?
The only difficulty I have seen on a routine basis from voters is when we have a primary election where you select your candidates from one party or another, or if there's a third. And it seems the greatest obstacle there is people misunderstanding that, no, you have to pick a column. You have to pick a party versus, making selections across party lines. but that's the only significant difficulty I've experienced with our voters and our current system.
And I would agree with Loren that that is the main issue and the main cause for spoiled ballots in the primary. In addition, at healthcare facilities, we do get the question, I want to vote for all Democrats, or I want to vote for all Republicans. And then those residents are confused because some of the offices don't state what party affiliation a person might have. So the judges, don't have a party, you can't use that, you'll have to make a decision without it. And we're able to explain that. But I think ranked choice voting might be a little bit confusing, looking forward to that with a healthcare facility.
Great, thank you. All right, so this question is both for Deb and Jeanne again. So outside of the elimination of the primary, why does St. Louis Park need RCV, and what is the problem that it will solve?
Okay. The example that I like to give people is that it restores majority rule when there's multiple candidates running for an office. And so how that happens is if there's 4 candidates running for an office, like maybe Ward 1, and one candidate could win with 25% plus 1 vote. That's a very small percentage of all the voters that actually voted. Ranked choice vote candidates win with 50% plus 1. So that is a much better representation of what the voters actually want. And the other reason why I think that it really helps is that voters really like it. I actually stood outside the polls last November and talked to several people as they came out of the polls in Minneapolis. And overwhelmingly, people said that they really liked using the ranked choice voting. They like having more choice, that's what I heard the most, more choice. They really liked having that. And then the other bullet point I have on this is that it does reduce the influence of money. And so it's probably, hopefully, not a problem here in St. Louis Park, but you never know. I mean, it happens every once in a while in other elections. And so it does reduce the influence of money.
Well, to add to that, so the truth is in St. Louis Park, because the decision has already been made to eliminate the primary without replacing it with anything, then the community now will have elections that don't allow for candidates to win with a majority when there's a split competitive field of candidates, 3-way or more. And we see the consequences of what happens when we split that vote, and the candidate who doesn't have the support of the majority of the voters wins. Ranked choice voting simply allows St. Louis Park to replace the eliminated primary with a ranked ballot and ensure a majority winner in one single decisive election in November, when turnout is vastly higher and more diverse, and it's simple for voters to rank. Now I'm going to come back and address something that Chris had talked about, but ranked choice voting simplifies that process. What happens under traditional elections, and you've already identified that problem, is that most voters don't go to the primary election. Turnout was trending in St. Louis Park at about 5% or less for primary elections. So rightfully, you've identified the need to not hold a primary, but without replacing it with ranked choice voting, it presents those problems. What we've seen in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we've seen in other communities across the country, is what it additionally fosters. More choice, not just more choice in November for voters, but a choice that wouldn't come with the risk of the spoiler dynamic, and it fosters greater diversity in candidates, ethnically, politically, and across the community. And it helps create more diversity in who can win an election. We've seen in Minneapolis and St. Paul and elsewhere a tremendous growth in the diversity of candidates who win under ranked choice voting. And that's an important community feature as a community like St. Louis Park diversifies and requires a more robust system to make sure that the process is inclusive enough to better reflect that in winning elections.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. This next question is for David Schultz. It sounds like you've got a lot of experience investigating RCV. So the question is, are there any negative side effects or unintended consequences of RCV that we should be aware of?
Okay, so the question is unanticipated or negative effects. And part of it I'm going to sort of chalk up into sort of two different categories. One of them I think is lack of preparation in terms of implementing. And then the second I think is perhaps in a misunderstanding or I'd say misunderstanding in terms of what RCV is supposed to do. And for the first one is if we go back to when Minneapolis first implemented it back several election cycles ago, when we looked at the data, there was some initial voter confusion, relatively small, and some spoiled ballots in the process here, a little bit higher than we saw at previous election cycles. And one of the recommendations that I gave was that I didn't feel like the city did enough, at least at that first stage, to really do the education that it needed to explain to its citizens and to its residents, you know, what RCV was and how to do a variety of things in terms of voting and so forth. And I think one of the things that Minneapolis has learned from, and I think that St. Louis Park can learn from Minneapolis as well as St. Paul's experience, is how to do much better targeted education to groups. Because we shouldn't forget the fact also, it's not just the people who show up every 2 years or 4 years to vote, but we have to remember that every election cycle, we have a whole bunch of new people who've either moved in, who have turned 18, or whatever like that. And so I think that's the first thing that we can learn, is that if we don't prepare the proper foundation in terms of education, then we start to run into some problems. And I think that's the first one. The second one, I think, is a little bit of confusion. And it sort of gets me back to a question you had asked at some point here a couple people ago regarding whether or not it takes longer to get the results, you know, with RCV. And there's actually, I think, a misperception here. If we have a regular, what you call traditional election, where somebody wins by, let's say, 55% or something, we're pretty sure we know what the results are. And in RCV, when we first implemented it in Minneapolis, I think was it R.T. Rybeck won like an overwhelming election. We knew exactly what was going to happen. As far as I know, there's been no election in the United States with RCV which is dragged out for 9 months as it did with Frank and Coleman. And what I mean by that is the fact that when you get very, very close elections, what most of us forget about is that what happens on election night is the first cut. Is the first cut of what happens. And that even with traditional voting, until we actually get the canvassing board to certify an election, numbers can shift. I remember in A.B. Klobuchar's first election, between what she had on election night and her final numbers, was about 10,000 votes difference. I mention that because we think that we have the results immediately, you know, with traditional voting on election night. And again, if it's a blowout election, if it's a sufficient large majority, we do. But RCV, as well as traditional elections, if they're close, are going to take a little bit of time. But in the end of the day, there's no indication that RCV really, if we add in certification of elections, the canvassing board issues and so forth, that it really takes any more time than does a traditional election. But again, there's this perception that people think that, oh my gosh, with RCV, it's going to take weeks, it's going to take months to whatever to get to the results or something like that. No. At the end of the day, we're probably getting the results in at the same time, and we're getting it in time for the canvassing boards to certify the elections at the appropriate time. It may be more a question of us thinking that we've got to have the results right away.
Thank you. The next question is for Chris. What steps did election judges take to assist voters? You kind of answered this a little bit. To assist voters who are having trouble with understanding ranked choice voting, what type of help or other materials did you have available? I think you might have covered most of that.
Yeah, I'll just see if I can think of anything else. We did, well, I did talk about the interpreters. That was significant. We had folks that would bring kind of many waves of people in, and so we really needed to to be able to explain to the judges kind of a couple of things. One was the ranked choice voting, and then also the rules around how many folks can you kind of explain the ballot to versus how many folks can you help mark a ballot for. So there was some education there that had to happen. And then really just having things in a couple different ways. We had the sample ballots that were out front. We had somebody that was kind of the greeter and explaining folks to that. At that point, we had lots of us up at the counter when people were getting their ballot and kind of explaining again how to mark the ballot. And then we also had the written kind of tear-off sheets that people could take with them into the booth as a tool to help them understand as well.
Great, thank you.
The next question is for Ginny again, and that is, RCV appears to necessitate the increased use of manual processes to tabulate ballots. Does this increase the opportunity for human error, fraud, or manipulation of results?
I don't believe that the process introduces additional avenues for fraud. But yes, human error is a potential with any tabulation process where you have, humans are actually manually figuring out who the winner is. That risk was mitigated in Minneapolis by the way that they've set up their tabulation teams. So you have multiple teams of people who are trained on how to do the tabulation, and they're checking each other's work at each step of the way. So there are ways to mitigate that risk. I mean, I would add, of course, when you have any kind of tabulation, there's always risk for error. Machines can make errors too. Of course, our ballot scanners are very, very accurate. We have to do a post-election audit on them after every even year, and we find them to be wildly accurate. So keep that in mind. But yes, I do think that human error is an element that you do have to keep in mind and put some risk mitigation strategies in place for.
Thank you. The next question is again for Loren and Mary. How do we support non-English speaking voters, seniors, or people with disabilities at our polling locations?
Well, they've expanded the number of languages for our resource material to assist in instructing voters. So we have a broad spectrum of languages available to us. For those with some form of impairment, whether it's hearing or vision, we have what we call an automark system, which can work with the voters either visually or orally to walk through the ballot process. And in some instances, we've had to utilize the system that we've been taught, which is if a voter wants assistance from a judge, then we need to make certain that there's a representative of the two major parties, a judge who's affiliated or of the different parties, both participate in assisting the voter as kind of a check. Typically, with my experience of the voting process as a voter, but also as a judge, everybody who participates in that election goes through, the judges take an oath. And frankly, having worked across the spectrum in different organizations, nonprofit or even through corporations or business, volunteer organizations, the judges are a unique community because they all are there to execute an election that they want. I mean, they understand implicitly that they're working for the citizens. And this is our process, and everybody wants a clean election. And in that instance, I don't really recall having any significant difficulty helping voters. There have been some language challenges, but we haven't had to do any extraordinary measures in that regard. So I think we have enough resources. Now, the fact that Minneapolis and St. Paul, has a much broader society, more diverse, even though St. Louis Park is expanding, but I still don't recall any significant difficulty that our voters had And I think we have decent resources for that at this point.
Yes, in the past, we have used interpreter services over the phone, and that has been effective. I think I've only needed to use it once, however. Mostly non-English-speaking voters tend to have a family member with them. And that the voters may hit the booth at the same time, but if their parent, it's usually a parent, somebody my age, is having a problem determining how to handle the ballot, they are allowed to get assistance from, as Loren mentioned, either 2 election judges from different parties or that family member.
So, Mary, if I could ask just a quick follow-up question on that. Could you talk specifically about the senior, you had talked about healthcare facilities and as part of your experience? Does that fall into this category?
It does. We find many people are very hard of hearing, and many are visually impaired, and we don't have the AutoMark equipment with us in the healthcare facility. So depending on the circumstances, we will talk to the individual. Sometimes we'll have assistance from the healthcare facility staff to give us a heads up that this person may have difficulty hearing in their right ear, but if you shout into their left ear, they're fine. So, you know, we make it work. And we even go to rooms to help voters vote if they're unable to get down to the cafeteria or wherever the voting is taking place. But we always have 2 judges from different parties assist. So I guess one thing I would add is as we do the ballots, probably 90% of those in the healthcare facilities, we are completing the ovals. So most of them do involve 2 different judges assisting a voter. Even if that voter is quite able to hear and see, they may just want us to mark it because they're concerned that they might go out of bounds or have a problem.
Thank you.
This question is for Deb Brinkman and Jeanne Massey again. The question is, can you explain what you mean by voter participation and how it relates or doesn't relate to voter turnout? Do you understand the difference there, hopefully?
Yes, I
Thank you.
believe I understand the difference. So I think one of the biggest reasons why voter participation leads to more voters participating or actually voting is because voters are encouraged to listen to all of the candidates and their messages, that gets them just more engaged in the whole process. The other reason, I think voters have a better chance of selecting a winner. I mean, everybody likes to select the winner. So with the ranked choice vote system, maybe their first place candidate isn't going to win, but there's a chance that their second or third or whatever vote will select the winner. And I think that is very enticing to the voter. And then I believe that the increased civility in the campaign messages, I think that is very appealing to the voter. I know it is to me. And so I've heard that many times that people don't like the negative messages that a lot of times people are receiving. So I think that is another way that people are enticed to the actual polls. That, and then I think people are finding it easy. As I said, I stood outside some of the polls in November, and people, and I said, did you think it was easy or was it hard? And overwhelmingly, people said it was easy. So I think when you have a system that's new, different, it does a better job of representing what the voter wants, and it's easy, I think that makes it very enticing for voters to actually get out of the house and go put their ballot in the ballot box.
An additional side to that, getting at the participation versus the voter turnout piece, ranked choice voting automatically increases voter participation by rolling the primary into the general election. Because the primary turnout is so low, you're excluding most voters in a very decisive election, narrowing that field to 2 candidates. And communities of color especially disadvantaged in those primary elections because they turn out in far fewer numbers than other voters. So it automatically increases voter participation by combining the two into one, bringing together the most voters with the most candidates, again, in one single election in November, when turnout is at its greatest and when it's most diverse. We saw in Minneapolis and St. Paul this year, you've commented it already, how much voter turnout increased, not just the participation, which is inherent in the process of using ranked choice voting, but turnout increased, and it was nearly over 40% in Minneapolis, a turnout that we hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. And that is in great part for the reasons Deb described, because there were so many more candidates in highly competitive elections, engaging all those voters on election day and giving them good reasons to turn out and rank their first choice, second choice, and third choice.
Thank you. This kind of rolls nicely into the next question for David, which is there a causal relationship between ranked choice voting and the higher turnout in the Minneapolis and St. Paul in the 2017 election cycle? What other factors can influence voter turnout?
There's a lot of factors that can influence voter turnout, and it's hard to sort of separate out and come conclusively say ranked choice voting is the reason. I mean, a variety of factors. Some of them are the perception that that these are very close elections. I think is always going to be an important one. For example, going back to, again, when R.T. Ryback ran for election, the turnout was relatively low that year, partly because most people didn't anticipate that this was going to be a very difficult election. So when you have close competitive elections, I think that's one factor. I think when you also have lots of candidates running, each of those candidates do what? They do their own work in time trying to reach out to their base, to do education, which helps in terms of inform people that something is going on in terms of an election. I think sometimes we have to start to look at also other factors in terms of whether there is more or less media coverage in terms of affecting campaigns and elections. I think one of the unfortunate things that happens, no matter what election system we look at, is that my own personal bias is that local elections are the most important elections in the country. Local elections are about what? Who's going to decide the decisions about picking up the garbage, about fire, about police, about roads. These are the quality of life issues. They're so important, but yet the media doesn't give enough focus or attention to saying, guess what, there are local elections. And so the more that the media can also be involved. What I'm getting at here is that we could probably chart out media, number of candidates, how hard they campaign, how much money they raise, a whole bunch of different variables all stand alongside next to ranked choice voting as factors that I think influence election turnout. But having sort of said all of that, again, with ranked choice voting, one of the questions you asked me before is that it does address the spoiler issue. It does address the question of where people saying, why should I vote? Why should I get engaged? Because now it creates sort of an incentive for people to say that my voice might actually matter. I might actually either pick the winner, or in some situations, it might be that I have candidates who are reaching out to me, because even though I'm going to vote for Jane Doe as my first choice, John Doe, as another candidate, still wants to talk to me to try to encourage me to vote for him. So there are a lot of factors, and I would be hesitant to say there's any one sort of silver bullet out there in terms of identifying it. But ranked choice voting combined with a variety of other things that are going on out there will increase turnout, and in many ways, ranked choice voting can be a catalyst for encouraging, again, those additional candidates to run, to mobilize their bases, to reach out to voters. So it clearly fits in here. If I were in a political science class, we would talk about things like factor analysis, and I won't bore you folks with all that stuff, or we could actually try to figure out what impact it has. I'll just simply stipulate there's a few studies out there that are saying that it does have an impact.
Thank you, sir. The next question is for Chris again. This is, had there not been a decisive winner in the last election, what other responsibilities would the election judges in St. Paul have had in the counting and tabulation process?
Sure. So I was not one of the election judges that was trained for kind of the next step if that were to happen. But a couple of the judges that I did serve with in early voting were trained if they needed to. In St. Paul, they also do manual tabulations. So My understanding was that there would need to be kind of a manual process of sorting and going through the rounds of votes as people dropped off, and then going to second choice and moving through.
Thank you.
All right, now we're back to Ginny. As new ballot tabulating technology emerges, will the cost to St. Louis Park be disproportionately higher because the city will be an early adopter, outlier relative to the rest of the United States?
So I thought this was kind of an interesting question. To the extent that St. Louis Park has costs that would be related to ranked choice voting, I'm not sure that they would be related to the fact that it would be an early adopter, at least as far as technology goes. Hennepin County purchased new equipment in 2013. That has a shelf life of 10 to 15 years, so you can do the math about the next time we'll be going out for an RFP. Ranked choice voting capabilities are one thing among many that we consider when we go out for RFP to purchase. Last time we did it, there was still limited technology available in federally certified equipment for tabulating ranked choice voting elections. So, we'll kind of have to see what the market has available next time we go out. It actually is helpful for us to have cities on board with whatever their particular algorithm is, because that's something that we can put into the RFP when we go to make a purchase.
Sorry, we're taking a look at our questions and realizing that you'd kind of answered one of the next questions, so we didn't want to repeat ourselves too much. This question again is for Loren and Mary, and that is, what are typical issues you run into on election day? How much is understanding the ballot or how to mark a ballot an issue for voters on election day?
I don't think that marking a ballot is a significant issue on election day. I've experienced a broad spectrum of problems on election day, some that I heard from the city clerk that they'd never experienced before. Those were location, maintenance issues, et cetera. But for executing the process of the election, I don't perceive that marking the ballot is a significant one. It typically has to do with resolving maybe a registration issue, determining the eligibility of a voter, particularly for somebody who has like a felony conviction. In the instance where you have a voter that maybe has a disability, a language problem, those types of issues are the ones that take more of our attention than marking a ballot. And as was pointed out previously, most people don't pay attention to the demonstration judge. And in fact, when family members come in and they have children, they're the ones who pay attention to the demonstration judge. So in that regard, I don't think marking the ballot is a significant issue. I think if there's appropriate education and the voters prepared for the type of choice they're going to see, and we have the sample ballots up, we put the sample ballots on the external, as you enter the voting place. They're on the inside of the voting place. There have been times with larger elections where people actually take the time to review that ballot to get their mind around, what offices are up, who's there. Some people come in with notes or their electronic device, waiting to mark their ballot. But I don't think marking the ballot is a significant problem on election day.
And I would agree with Loren. The only thing that I would add, assuming ranked choice voting, is that we would have a new demonstration ballot to use that would show how the groupings fall for the ranked choice votes. Because I'm assuming part of the ballot won't be ranked choice, because those offices that aren't ranked choice are going to still follow the old rules. So having those ranked choice offices grouped somehow and having that on the demonstration ballot, I think would address those issues.
Thanks. So this next question is also for Deb and Jeanne. So please describe your pre-election education efforts to explain the RCV process to voters.
Okay, I'll just preface this with saying with any change in a voting system, the League of Women Voters is very insistent upon adequate voter education. So just the fact that we've gotten rid of the primaries is going to require education. We have to let the voters know what the change is. By adding ranked choice voting, obviously we would be adding different kinds of education. What we've been doing so far is we've been giving voters practice voting. We held a couple events. We did a Rank Your Brew event at Steel Toe. We did a media briefing that kind of explained the process and what we're doing. We did a beer tasting and wine tasting at Top 10 Liquors, and those have all been great events, very well attended. We've had very good, okay, it's fun too. And it gives people an opportunity to ask questions about the system and about what we're doing. And as Loren says, I think the actual process of voting is just simply easy. That's the feedback that we receive from everyone. But I've also attended a couple different advocacy fairs recently and talking to more people about ranked choice voting, and overwhelmingly people are very open to trying it and really want to take a look at it. As we continue with this process, we'd be partnering still with FairVote and maybe other organizations and with the city. Of course, one of the things we would want to do is get a sample ballot mailed out to all the homes. We would want a couple education events, largely I think with voter registration events, and then we'd hit some of the healthcare facilities because a lot of times they're changing their residents. And then, of course, we would be doing some additional voting or education with candidate forums. And so we've got plenty of other opportunities and very many other ideas, too. So stay tuned.
I think it's helpful to understand in all of the election implementations in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and this is true in other cities that use ranked choice voting, but I think Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular, we've made a real concerted effort to raise money for public education around ranked choice voting, and so that we can partner with the communities and the cities where they do a particular function around ranked choice voting, mostly through mass media or through a sample mailing out to voters. FairVote Minnesota can go deeper and attend community events and have a more grassroots approach to education. We usually do education in 3 buckets. We educate candidates and campaigns, we educate voters, and we educate media so that the media is communicating properly about ranked choice voting. And the kinds of, the breadth of education activities that we do, and we would do it in St. Louis Park and other communities that come on board with ranked choice voting, is that we table at every community event available so that voters are getting that exposure to the practice of using ranked choice voting and to literature using ranked choice voting. We appear on media. We make sure that we attend all of the candidate events and explain ranked choice voting to people who are attending those candidate events, because we know that those are going to be voters. We go into the assisted living facilities. We go into apartment complexes. It's wide and it's deep, and we do as much as possible. That doesn't mean we catch them all. So a couple of things to note in terms of what Chris was identifying that not every voter knew at the polls. We know through our own exit polling, and I'll get into more depth because I know that's a separate question, we know that most people, 2/3 or more, are familiar with ranked choice voting before they go to the polls. That means there's a chunk that hadn't yet been educated. Fair enough. A lot of people are not as tuned in as others. So that's really critical that the election judges are there providing that last touch of voter education. We also saw, especially with communities of color, in the Hmong community, if that was part of who was turning up early to vote, and in the Somali community, where candidates would be actively getting voters to the polls and, unfortunately, actively encouraging them to vote for only them. rather than to rank their ballots. A lot of the voter education we do is mitigating the impact of that and making sure they understand the impact or understand the need to rank. So we know that that had happened, and the voter education that we do moving forward needs to continue to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Next question is for David Schultz. Is RCV an artificial means of creating a majority out of a plurality? And then the follow-up is, what is wrong with the simple winner-take-all approach to current elections?
Let me start with the latter question, in terms of how you posed it here, is that I think one of the things that we've increasingly seen in a polarized society, we know this is happening at the national level, at the state level, is that we have 40% voting for one side, 40% voting for another, or something like that. And we're starting to see situations where candidates don't have to appeal to the other side, that in a traditional voting system, whoever gets the plurality wins, and that's it. They win with their base. They don't have to win over necessarily in some situations, especially if 3 candidates are running. They don't have to try to win over the other side. They don't have to try to appeal to the independents. Just run base politics, and that's it, and you have enough to be able to succeed. And I think that's sort of encouraging, and we have, again, political science research that is suggesting that's sort of helping feed into that pre-existing polarization by saying, I'm just going to speak to my people, they're going to speak to their people, and so forth like that. What ranked choice voting does is an effort, and certainly there are a lot of other reasons why we're polarized. There's certainly a lot of other things in our society that we need to try to overcome polarization. But what RCV can do is actually start to try to create real majorities. And by that, if we were in a different country, if we were in a parliamentary system, let us say in Europe, where they actually have to get cobbled together, real groups of like, 20% from this party, 30% from that party to form majorities and form them to work together. That's really forming majoritarian politics. Here, we don't seem to be doing that. And so what RCV does is to say, let's figure out a way of saying that we're going to try to figure out ways of making incentive structures, creating incentive structures for candidates to go beyond their base, to talk to others. Now, clearly, in situations, again, where if a place is overwhelmingly of one political party or something, it may have less efficacy in terms of doing that. But I do think this is an effort to try to force people to talk across aisles, to try to build real governing coalitions that involve compromise that we see too little of in our society right now. So I don't think it's trying to artificially create a majority. I think it's actually trying to create real majorities that we're not creating in the United States right now under our existing voting systems. I do want, in just a couple of seconds I have left here, I wanted to add one more thing. I hadn't thought about this before from a different subject here. When you were asking the question of a couple of others here about problems, and maybe are there any problems at the ballot box, with marking. I don't think the issue is ever really in-person voting for anything. We know that, for example, you have a better chance of winning the Powerball than showing there's in-person voter fraud, at an election site. And I'm true. I mean, the numbers really do pan that out here. What I would be interested and concerned about here is, if at all, is in trying to reach out to voters to make sure there's no confusion about RCV, it's those who are absentee voting, because that's always a challenge. It's always a challenge of reaching those people, because when they come into the ballot box, the voting booth, you got a chance. You have a chance as election judge to talk to them. We don't have that chance as absentees, and that's where I'd want to put more focus in terms of some of the education. And I would just be curious to find out if we looked at examples of where there were more mistakes, or the more mistakes with absentees. My bet is it probably is the case.
Thank you. So the next question is for Jeanne. Jeanne, have you completed any survey of voters who have used RCV to assess their level of satisfaction with this process, and what were the results?
The answer is yes, and we do that because we're as interested in as anybody is and making sure that we understand just how much impact the education has had and how much more education is needed for the next cycle around. So I think Melissa distributed to you the results of some of the election polling that we did in the last cycle, and we've done this every election cycle, and Minneapolis itself also does evaluation post-election, but not exit polling. I don't think St. Paul City has done any exit polling or evaluation. What you see in these numbers are very, very positive numbers, especially in the third cycle around in Minneapolis in 2017. By 2017, voters were really starting to get it, as were the candidates and the media in terms of how they were explaining it, and that all reflected in the numbers. What we saw in Minneapolis in terms of voters when we asked them, was ranked choice voting simple, complicated, in between? 92% of the voters said ranked choice voting was simple to use or very simple to use. That's a pretty astounding number. That's up from 85% 4 years ago in a very robust competitive election in Minneapolis. What we saw is the impact of social media playing into that. We saw a lot of voters sharing their ranking preferences before they went to the polls and influencing others to rank their ballot too. So in general, people went to the polls knowing what they were doing, familiar before they went to the polls, and they ranked. Almost 90% of voters ranked their ballots at least 2 candidates, and almost 80% had ranked all 3 available choices. That demonstrated a great deal of proficiency in voter understanding of the process and the ballot and the purpose of ranking. We also asked them if they liked the system and wanted to keep it. Again, the vast majority of voters not just understood it and did it well, they like it and want to keep using it. Again, for them, it simplifies the process. It doesn't require them to turn out twice, and they get to rank their ballots, and they enjoy that ranking process. And they rank knowing that if their first choice is too weak to make it through a round in the runoff, their second choice can count. That's empowering to voters, and they let us know that in these election polls. And this is true across all income groups, ethnic groups, and age groups. There's some slight variability, but very little. The vast majority of all those groups indicate high preference for the system and that they want to keep it. And they also have remarked on just how much more civility is experienced in these campaigns. We asked them about that, and they indicate that they find ranked choice voting elections more civil. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sure.
Ginny, the next question is for you. How are recounts handled in Minneapolis, electronically or manually, and what is the county's involvement?
So this is one area where the city is completely on its own. The county doesn't have any involvement with recounts at all. And in Minneapolis, they are handled entirely manually. They just did their first one, actually, in this last election. So it's a matter of, it's actually the way that St. Paul does all of their elections. They physically get the ballots out and do a piling method. So it's completely manual.
Okay, so this next question I'm going to throw to all 3 of the election judges on our panel. If St. Louis Park switched to RCV, what challenges or barriers might need to be addressed to help senior or non-English speaking voters better understand how to vote correctly on an RCV ballot?
I'm going to defer to you two, since you have more experience in this area.
Well, I think that I talked a lot about the challenges for St. Paul, and we had a couple of interpreters that were at our polling place all day that were provided by the county, and then we had folks that were coming in either from campaigns or just members of the community that were bringing folks in and providing rides. And so there was a real range of knowledge about the actual ballot versus just trying to translate and get people to the polls. And so I think I would suggest focusing some effort on the interpreters. But I think that some of the challenges too were that just the volume of people, because lots of folks were bringing in a number of people, whether it was a large family or it was a campaign that brought a van load of people, and they might have had one person acting in the interpreter role, and that did get very challenging. As far as trying to explain the ballot, because we really couldn't have 6 people standing up at the counter in front of one judge. We didn't have the space for that. And then if people actually needed assistance in the booth, that judge or that interpreter was kind of all over the room. So it did get to be a little bit challenging from a logistics standpoint.
And I guess I would add that I would foresee that we would have some multi-language signage that would address specifically the ranked choice voting rules for people that they could read as they wait to vote. Such things as don't vote for the same person all 3, 4, 5, or 6 times, depending, would be crucial to highlight in those instructions. And also getting the point across to those who are not accustomed to being able to cross party lines, either psychologically or because they're confusing this with a primary, that that's okay to do as well in their ranking.
Please.
I also, dovetailing to that, the comment with regards to space. In the several places that I've worked in St. Louis Park, I've had the privilege of working in voting locations where we have sufficient space. But that is not always the case, with our voting locations. So I could easily see where if you have, a large group coming in that wants or needs instruction, some of the precincts are going to have to give thought to how do they want to do that demonstration in a fashion where you can do more than 1 or 2 people standing in front of you. So that might be a consideration.
Thank you.
Jeanne, the next question is for you. This one's kind of got multi-parts to it. It's in any 2017 multi-candidate, as in 3 or more candidate election in Minneapolis and St. Paul, can you indicate the number of races, the number of candidates, how long did it take the election staff to tabulate and determine all the winners in the election after the precinct results were reported? And were computer systems adequate to handle this tabulation?
Sure. Big question. Minneapolis has big elections every 4 years. Ginny knows this. And by the way, I just want to give great deal of credit for Ginny Gelms for helping institutionalize the process in Minneapolis while she was there. It really has been a process that has now been mimicked across the country. It has gone so well and has only gotten better in Minneapolis. So kudos to you. Ginny, too, could answer this question, but I'll get started. In Minneapolis, there are a total of 22 races, 25 candidates winning. We have not just mayor and city council. We have a mayor, 13 council races, and then park board races and the Board of Estimate and Taxation, 2 of which of those are multi-seat races. So we elect all of the local officials in 1 year. Every 4 years, everything is on the ballot. Of the races this year, the mayor's race was highly competitive in about 8 of 13 council races. The park board at-large race was competitive, and half of the park district races were competitive. The Board of Estimate and Taxation was not competitive. So most races were competitive, 3-way plus, and most of those required additional rounds of counting in the tabulation process. To simplify it for everybody, the mayor's race took less than 3 hours to count, and I'll emphasize the improvement that's been since 2009. In 2009, before the replacement of the voting equipment, the equipment couldn't even read the ballot and create a data file of rankings, which it now can. In 2009, people created that data file of rankings, and that took 2 weeks. 2009, we sped the process up to 3 days. And in 2013 was 3 days, 2017 was 1 day. The mayor's race was less than 3 hours, a council race about an hour, a little bit less, depending on just how many rounds were required in order to reach that conclusion. So it's gotten very, very fast. I'll add here that It's part of my job to stay on top of voting tabulation systems as much as I can. The day is coming when those automatic tabulation systems are going to be here. St. Louis Park could potentially benefit in 2019 from that process. That's in the works. If it doesn't, and if ranked choice voting is adopted here in St. Louis Park and implemented, and you use the Minneapolis system, those city council races or the mayor's race would really take no more than roughly an hour apiece. If you adopt the Minneapolis voting system, that's how fast it can go. Now that would require resources. You need people around a table in order to make those tabulations happen. But assuming those resources are there, the process to make it go fast is certainly in place and usable for St. Louis Park.
That was a very concise answer to a very complex question. Thank you.
We've been through it before.
The next question is for Ginny. How does RCV work with ballot rotation requirements per Minnesota law?
It essentially works the same as on a traditional ballot. You have, depending on how many choices you have, in Minneapolis we have 3 choices, so the rotation is the same in all 3 choices, but we rotate the candidates on a precinct by precinct basis, just like we would if it were a traditional ballot.
Would you mind explaining that a little bit more about what ballot rotation means?
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
We actually happen to have one of the most complicated rotation algorithms in the country. So ballot rotation, the idea behind it is to avoid giving any one candidate the advantage of being listed first on the ballot in every single precinct. So rotation is to vary that, so not the same candidate is always listed first. I could go into how it is that we actually assign which candidate goes first in which precinct, but it's kind of complicated. The end result is that we aim to have the same, or as close to as possible, the same number of registered voters seeing candidates listed first in each precinct.
Thank you.
We're starting to exhaust some of the questions we have for some of you. So if we're not calling on you, I hope you understand that's just, those are all the questions we had at the moment. So the next question we're going to go to is for David Schultz. And the question is, what does evidence show about voter participation with ranked choice voting? Is it increased, and is it more equitable?
I'm going to say that the evidence is somewhere between some positive increases in voter turnout versus saying that it's no worse than in the traditional system. And the reason why I say that, it relates back to a question you asked me before in terms of how do we sort out all the different variables that factor into why in a particular election that we have higher turnout. You know, I mean, we can generally show that in cities across the country that have implemented ranked choice voting, and I want to stay within the United States because, you know, getting us out the United States, we get a whole bunch of other variables that are involved here. But among cities in the United States that have introduced it, there seems to be some evidence of an uptick overall in terms of political participation, in terms of actually, you know, showing up for voting. Again, if we're and we'll talk about just for a general election as opposed to, you know, the issue that Jeanne brought up before about the issue of eliminating low turnout at primaries. We're just going to focus it on general election here. Again, there seems to be some evidence of uptick there, but that evidence of uptick is probably correlated also with what? More candidates running, voters feeling like they have the perception of more choices. And if we put all that together there, again, I think we can point to some evidence of it. Now, are we going to see situations where it's going to be, I don't know, 10, 20% increase? I don't see data suggesting that, but are we seeing at least strong single digits, all things being equal in terms of increases? Yes, we clearly are. And then again, depending on how many additional candidates and how well they campaign and so forth, we might see more. But the simple answer is, if you're concerned that people are going to say, oh my gosh, I don't understand ranked choice voting, I'm not going to vote. We clearly haven't seen any of that. We've not seen any decrease in voting as a result. And in fact, what we have seen is, again, some evidence of increasing voter turnout over time.
This question is for Jeanne. Please describe the vote tabulation process in an RCV election.
All right, again, Ginny, fill in where I might not have the full process complete, but my understanding of the process in Minneapolis is different in St. Paul. St. Paul does count the ballots like we would do in a mock election. We pile the ballots on a table, and then we eliminate a candidate who doesn't have enough votes and physically transfer those ballots to the remaining candidates based on their second choices. In St. Paul, again, they're working toward automatic voting tabulation systems as well. In Minneapolis, that too is the goal. But Minneapolis has shortcutted the process by creating a data file of rankings. So the machines read the ballots and create a data file of the rankings. Every voter, the cast ballot record is created so that in the Minneapolis election in 2017, for example, there were almost 106,000 voters. So there were 106,000 rows of data, 3 columns deep, how everyone ranked. It's that data file that then gets exported from the machines and imported into the spreadsheets that Ginny was referring to. And those spreadsheets simply allow the tabulators to aggregate everyone who ranks in exactly the same way. So if everyone in this room were participating in that election, we all voted A, B, C, all of our ballots are combined together, and if A drops, all of our ballots go to B because we voted all for B as a second choice. And so they manually take that information and drag it to that next candidate. And they just keep going through that process of eliminating candidates and reallocating those ballots to remaining candidates until one reaches that winning threshold. Now, I know one question will come or is related to the issue of ballot exhaustion, so I can manage that here as we talk about the tabulation process. So when you get the election results in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis has been very good about reporting out to the public each race and how those rounds of balloting happen, and they actually increased the sophistication of their reporting this year by adding a lot of graphics to the process to make it easier for the visual learner. Some ballots get exhausted in that reallocation process. When a voter has a preference, just 1 deep or 2 deep, and they don't want to rank anymore, that's up to them. They're just simply saying, I don't care who wins after my preferences are ranked. And those ballots, if there's not a remaining candidate based on, or still in contention on their ballot will go into the exhausted pile rather than get reallocated to someone. We try to minimize that ballot exhaustion in our voter education. Our message to voters is really straightforward, which is the more candidates that you rank, the more power your ballot has. It's to your advantage to rank. So most voters do as we saw in the data, but not everyone. So you will see some exhausted ballots in that final tabulation process. The candidate who wins always has a majority of the final ballots cast in that round, even if it's not a full majority of those initial ballots cast. So when you see that full report out on the city's website, it's important to know how to understand those results.
If I may, I just wanted to add, there's one other scenario where you could end up with exhausted ballots, and that's where even if the voter has selected all of their choices, they ended up selecting, say, all 3 candidates that they selected were eliminated earlier in the counting process.
Correct, and that gets to the difference in the number of rankings afforded in Minneapolis versus St. Paul. and St. Louis Park has a choice there. FairVote Minnesota would recommend going beyond 3, and I think Minneapolis will look at that issue when it has tabulation software that would allow it to accommodate more than those 3 rankings. 3 is usually sufficient in a council race that has 4 or 5 candidates, where you see often the desire to go beyond ranking 3 is in those big mayoral contests where you have 4, 5, 6, 7 candidates in contention. That's when that desire to rank beyond 3 is important. St. Paul allows for that in ordinance. Minneapolis does as well, but the machinery hasn't allowed for that process to take place yet. moving forward, Minneapolis hopes that it will.
Thank you. This is actually kind of a follow-up, but it's one of our questions. So I'm just going to, in your, let's see, in situations where, hang on just a second, which one? In your experience, do most voters actually take advantage of RCV by casting votes for first, second, third choices, or do a substantial number of voters only vote for their first choice? This is to you, Ginny, sorry.
So we've seen that's varied by election. As Jeanne was mentioning earlier, in 2017, and just looking at the mayor's race in Minneapolis, there were only 12% of voters who only made one selection. If you add up all of the voters who only made one or two, you ended up with 25% of voters. We saw much higher rates of that in 2009. For mayor that year, only half of the voters, over half of the voters only made one selection. And then if you're just looking at voters who made only one or two selections, you ended up with 2/3 of the voters. So it's varied by election.
And I'll just clarify there, to your point, David, earlier, when there's a competitive election, people will rank. There's a purpose. But in incumbent-driven elections where people anticipate the outcome before they rank, then there's not as much incentive to rank the ballot. And we see that across all those races. It really is those competitive three-way plus races where we see the highest amount of ranking. That makes sense.
The next question is back to David Schultz. What is your view on the implication of a majority winner having a clearer mandate and increased legitimacy versus a plurality winner? And does ranked choice voting create clear majority winners?
You're asking a really good philosophical question here, of which I can state my preference, But, if we think of a hallmark of a representative democracy, it's supposed to be what? Majority rule balanced by respect for minority rights. And what I mean by that is I say to my students, all things being equal, if 50% plus one of the population wants to do X, I don't know, raise taxes, lower taxes, whatever it is like that, is that the prerogative of the majority? At least in our thinking all considered about how representative democracy is supposed to operate, the answer is yes. And so the more that we can create, I think, real majorities, there is a perception that, at least in our way we think about a democracy, representative democracy, that decisions are legitimate. When you have the idea of saying that 10% or 20% or somebody won with only 40% of the vote or something like that, there's a perception that that person really doesn't speak for the people. And if we take seriously this notion that says, as our first three words of our Constitution say, we the people, we generally, I think, want to hope it's going to be what? The majority that speaks. That's a political philosophy, and it's one that I generally endorse. Maybe not everybody does. That's why I said it's a philosophical question here, in terms of it. But I generally do think that it's better to have majority speak, and it's better for representatives to be able to say they are representing majorities. Of which also I still hope that those representatives are trying to reach out and not just think they only represent those people who voted for them, but everybody else also. But again, that's a matter of personal philosophy here. Does ranked choice voting, create better majorities? Now, I know clearly people are going to point to situations, for example, when Betsy Hodges was elected, where I think what she fell short was like 49 point, what was it? I can't remember what the exact number is, like that, slightly below or something. But in general, ranked choice voting is going to ensure that we have a numerical majority. But more importantly, I come back to the point that I was making before. We're not just talking about numerical majorities. I'm going to talk about consensual majorities. And what I mean by that is that and again, this is a normative statement here. It's about whether or not candidates who are elected to office are running for office and are elected in such a way that they're reaching out not just to their base, not just to those people who say, I'm with Schultz or whatever it is, no matter what or something like that, but an effort is made to try to reach out to other voters and speak to them. And I think ranked choice voting does a better job of trying to get people within a broader coalition than does our traditional voting system.
Thank you. This question is for Jeanne. If voters have a difficult time understanding differentiators separating candidates in a winner-take-all system, how will voters become more educated with a greater number of candidates for which they may vote for under RCV?
Good question. In any election, voters need education. Voters are all over the map in terms of how educated they decide to get before they head to the polls. It doesn't matter the election system. Some go super educated. They're the activists. They're going to caucuses. They're going to conventions. They're going to every candidate forum, and they're going to vote on election day. Super educated voter. Others are going to have lifestyles and situations that simply allow them to barely know there's an election, call their friend before election day, or at the booth, who do I vote for, right? That happens. It's not going to change no matter if it's ranked choice voting election or if it's a traditional election. That's how voter behavior varies. Under ranked choice voting, it's the same, and the need for us, implicit in that is that ranking is a little bit more difficult than voting for just one, but in reality, that's not what we find voters are experiencing for two reasons. One, in order to make one choice, you have to evaluate the others and know that's your choice. So you're already evaluating other candidates while you're making that single choice. The second is, under the current system of plurality, we need to be strategic in how we vote, and that's what makes voting complicated for voters. When I go to the polls and I can only vote for one, and I believe that one, well, gee, I'm really not voting my heart, because if I vote for the candidate I really like, I might actually help elect the candidate I like the least. And I certainly don't want to spoil the election for the candidate I don't want to win. And so voters have to be strategic, and there's really nothing more dissatisfying to a voter than to have to be strategic at the polls. Ranked choice voting takes that all away from voters. It eliminates that need. It allows voters to vote their true heart, knowing that if their first choice is not shared as a favorite candidate by most voters, and that candidate gets defeated in the runoff, their second choice can count. That's liberating, and that's simple for voters to be able to rank their preferences. And that's one reason why voters find ranked choice voting so appealing and why it's so popular with voters.
May I chime in on one other point?
Please.
Okay, I just want to chime in another point here. You know, I've been teaching political science, you know, for probably 30 years. And one of the things that has really struck me between teaching that and having been, you know, the executive director for Common Cause, one of the, I think, the central failings of our society right now is we put too little resources into civic education across the board. You know, and whether it's the system that we're using now or whatever else it does, you know, I mean, we do a really lousy job in our system in terms of educating people about our political system, about a whole bunch of different things. And again, if I were waving my magic wand, you know, I would say we need to do a much better job. I used to be a fan of what they did in the state of Washington, for example. I think they still do, where they put together voter education books so people have some place to turn to. So I think in general, we need to do a better job across the board as a society, you know, in terms of this. And I'm not just saying this as an educator, I'm just saying as a citizen, as somebody who worked in this area. We need to do a better job on that. The second point I wanted to make here is that I know some of my political science colleagues, you know, will say that ranked choice voting asks too much of voters. It asks them to try to understand too much and try to do too much research. And the fact of the matter is, and I think your statistics bore this out, is that in some situations, you know, that people only cast one vote. Why? Because they've looked at it and said, I've got one person I really like. I don't like the rest of them, and that's perfectly reasonable. There are some situations where people say, I got a couple of candidates I like, and so forth. But the point is, you know, is that what I think we can find here is that voters, if can actually gather the resources and figure out ways of being able to figure out who they want to vote for. Now, whether or not I would agree with those choices is another story entirely, but I don't think there's any real good evidence out there to suggest that the voters are so overwhelmed by what's happened in Minneapolis, St. Paul, what's happened in Cambridge, Massachusetts, what's happened in San Francisco, that they walk away in disgust and say, I'm just too stupid. I can't figure out how to do this. If anything, I think the voters have shown that they can make good discriminating choices, which is why I think sometimes they only cast one vote, because there's only one person they really like.
Thanks. Go ahead, Loren.
From a layman's perspective, I echo his sentiments, but my perception from my involvement has been that as our society has moved towards more polarization, or the perception of gridlock, or the legislative process has become more contentious, this is not diminished participation or turnout. This is energizing citizens to realize we have to participate because that's the only way we're going to make a change. And so in that regards, the idea that ranked choice voting is too complex, I would say you are underestimating your citizens. They are looking for tools and methods by which they can begin to participate in something maybe they've ignored, but the result of that ignoring or not participating is becoming so prevalent that more citizens are starting to participate rather than being alienated. Now, that might not be true across all communities of our diverse society, but I would hope that by moving forward on these processes, it actually encourages more of our society to be engaged.
Thanks to all of you. I appreciate you chiming in. Unfortunately, we're going to kind of switch subjects because that's where the questions lead us, unfortunately. But this question is for Ginny, and this is basically, based on your general experiences, does RCV make your job as an election administrator harder or more difficult? Can you please explain?
You're lobbing me that question after we had the love fest around ranked choice voting. I have to say, honestly, it does make the job as an election administrator more difficult. And I would put in a plea. I know you guys are the Charter Commission, not the City Council, but if this is something that passes in St. Louis Park, you need to give your city clerk's office all raises. It does make their job more difficult. And the ways that it makes it more difficult are, well, before I go into that, I will say St. Louis Park would benefit from the fact that Minneapolis and St. Paul have already tread this road. So they have learned some lessons that you would be able to hit the ground running with in St. Louis Park. You would not be able to avoid, one of the most difficult things, in my opinion, is developing the expertise in-house in order to handle the actual tabulation of the ballots. That's, it's kind of an esoteric thing, and it is something that the staff would have to educate themselves on. There's no kind of canned training the county doesn't offer, the state doesn't offer. So that's one major difficulty. And of course, I think you've already heard a lot about the difficulty around educating your voters. That's something that we're still getting better at. And you can put a kind of a Herculean effort into making sure that your voters know what's going on before they get to the polls. They're still going to get to the polls and not have heard about it. Of course, you can have very effective training with your election judges, and that point of contact is very effective. I think David brought up a really interesting point about absentee voters. They're difficult to reach, particularly those male voters. Another aspect, and this is kind of a confluence of trends that are happening in the elections world right now. We are seeing in Minnesota a lot more people choosing to vote by absentee, and the percentage of people who are doing that, the numbers of people who are doing that, it's trending toward people who are absentee voting in person, which happens here in your city hall, and your clerk's office is inundated with folks who are doing that prior to election day, and they will need a lot of help in doing that education piece for those in-person absentee voters. So you will need to put some resources into people, into training, into education for your voters, and all of that goes into making the job harder for your election administrators. It's not impossible, obviously. We did it, but.
This question is for David. Please explain the weighted inclusive Gregory method and how it works.
You know what?
You actually don't need to know this.
Okay.
That's right.
Thank you,
I
Ginny.
don't
You
know who
don't,
asked that question.
it's not applicable to St. Louis.
Yeah.
Yes. And
It's
I-
a great question.
And I was going to say, we don't have enough time, and we're going to take a pass on that
Okay,
one, because
fair
you don't need to know all that stuff.
Fair
Okay,
enough.
okay.
But I do want to highlight, I think someone had asked it in an earlier meeting, the ordinance language in Minneapolis and St. Paul reads single transferable vote, AKA ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting. The technical term that incorporates the use of ranked voting in both a single seat election and a multi-seat election, which Minneapolis has, but St. Paul and St. Louis Park do not have, is single transferable vote. So the technical term for that methodology is that. That's why you see it in the language, and perhaps why the question is being raised, and why it would possibly be the way that it's phrased in St. Louis Park, but it would be only applicable in the single seat election and not use the Gregory weighted method.
Thank you.
This question goes back to Ginny. Please describe the county's pre-election education efforts to explain RCV process to the voters in Minneapolis.
This is another area where the city is kind of on its own. So we do general education with our voters. Our role is a lot more robust in even years when we have county and state elections. The city does all of the education with regard to how to mark the ballot, how the ballots are counted in a ranked choice voting election.
Ginny, we're just going to keep you in the hot seat for the next couple questions,
Okay.
and then we'll ask a question that everyone can answer kind of as a wrap-up, and then we'll open up to other questions from the Charter Commission. As an election administrator, what additional training was or would have been helpful for voters in an RCV election?
As has been discussed earlier this evening, it's actually, it's not too difficult to educate your voters on how to mark the ballot. There is an education piece. That's something that is fairly easily done even in the polling place if they haven't heard anything about ranked choice voting before they get there. A harder piece is explaining to voters how the ballots are counted. And that's important for voters to know because it's important to help them in understanding what voting strategies make sense in a ranked choice voting situation and which don't help their candidates. A common misperception is that it will help my candidate if I only vote for them and nobody else. If voters had a better understanding of how ballots are counted in ranked choice voting, they would understand that that's not a strategic way to vote. That's a difficult piece, and I don't have a silver bullet for that. That's a difficult piece for getting voters to understand and for explaining in a succinct way in a soundbite that can go on the news or in something that people will actually sit down and read. So that piece, I think, and I think another piece too is for candidates, so that they can understand best how to campaign under ranked choice voting and what campaigning strategies make sense for them. That was a little bit difficult for us to handle as administrators. Of course, FairVote and other organizations kind of pick that up there. But as administrators, it's difficult to remain neutral, but also explain the system in a way that's helpful for candidates.
This next question is for Ginny, but this is actually pretty interesting, and I think there might be some others of you that might want to jump in as well if you have a comment on it. So the question is, in situations where one ballot contains races using the RCV method and races that use the traditional voting method, do you sense voters are confused or discouraged by having two different voting styles on one ballot?
Our experience so far is we don't actually have any experience with that. We had one election in Minneapolis where we had a couple of ballot questions that were yes or no, so obviously that's not too difficult to have on the same ballot with ranked choice voting. This is something that I think would be, I would think this would be a difficulty for St. Louis Park when you had school board on the same ballot, especially because your school board, it would be a vote for multiple. It's a multi-seat. So I think that would be particularly tough to educate your voters on. For this part of the ballot, vote for one in each column. For this part, absolutely do not mark more than one in each column. For this part, you have to, you don't have to, but you are allowed to. So I think that would be a tough education piece. As far as the ballot design, that would also be a little bit difficult, and it would depend on how many choices St. Louis Park ended up going with in terms of how much ballot real estate is taken up with your ranked choice voting section. it's helpful that we don't run into legal issues that we would if you were in an even year. I'm not sure that you could run a ranked choice voting election in an even year and have the county and state races on the ballot, because we are conscribed. We have to have the offices in a certain order, and we can't go back and forth between traditional ranked choice. The system just can't handle that. So probably what we would end up doing with St. Louis Park is we would have all of your city offices maybe on one side of the ballot and your school district on the back side. I think just thinking about it up here, I think that's probably the best way that we could go about it, and that would provide some clear demarcation for your judges to explain to your voters, on this side, this is what you do, on this side, this is what you do.
That's exactly what we did in St. Paul in the last election, is we had the mayoral race on one side and the school board on the other. And so it was actually quite helpful to have it laid out that way, to say, on this side, these are your instructions. On the other side, these are your instructions.
And I'll add that, again, the exit polling from the voters and the immediate information we get back from the voters doesn't indicate that that's an added confusion for them. If the front side is ranked and vote for up to 3 on the back side, that has not, according to the information we have, tripped up voters in any way, and they continue to rank their ballots on the front side. What we know is that Joe Mansky, after the election a couple of years ago, had remarked that it was the smoothest election he had seen in St. Paul in all of his years as election judge or election administrator in St. Paul. So it's real testimony to, I think, the ease with which the city had constructed the ballot and educated voters, along with the assistance of FairVote Minnesota and League of Women Voters and other organizations, in really putting forward a process that was going to be easy for voters to understand. We know from experience, and Ginny here and other election judges know, that it's very important to design a ballot that's easy for voters. You can create a bad ballot. We know from Florida in 2000 that any ballot can be badly designed under the current traditional system and badly designed under a ranked choice voting system. It's our goal, and I think the cities have done a really tremendously good job at this, at designing the most user-friendly ballots they can for ranked choice voting as they get started in rolling this out. So kudos to the cities for doing that.
The only thing I can think is a challenge here, I think you used the phrase ballot real estate, and I think it's a good phrase. Okay, is a situation where in even number of year elections, if it were used, and you had to rank choice vote for all the judicial candidates. You know, and everybody's grimacing because you know what I'm referring to here. And so I'm just trying to think through the complexity of just how it wouldn't be the complexity in terms of setting up the ranked choice voting. It would be how much real estate and how would we design that, because you know some of you have voted like I have, where you got 10, 15, 20 judicial candidates on the ballot here. I mean, how much space we're going to have. So that would be, I think, a different issue down the line here in terms of how you would design a ballot that would be readable enough to be able to accommodate that many candidates.
I guess I had pictured a ballot not listing every candidate's name 3 times. And I did take a peek at the Minneapolis ballot, and I was kind of appalled that that amount of real estate was being used. I had pictured a list of names and 3 ovals next to each name. Number 1, number 2, number 3. And I don't know if that's an equipment restriction or what, but it didn't match what I had envisioned.
You're correct. It's an equipment limitation that had required the ballot to be designed to duplicate the candidate names. It's not best practice. Education has mitigated the impact of seeing the candidates listed several times, but there's probably some overvoting or multiple candidate voting happening because of that. Best practice is to identify the candidates once and then 3 rows or 4 rows, whatever, over to identify that. When that tabulation software equipment is upgraded in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the communities will have an opportunity to design the ballot in that fashion, which is used across the country in that way.
Is it possible to ask a question of one of our attendees?
Sure. Charter Commission
So
says
Ginny,
yes.
you are in a situation where you're looking at the technology and the vendors with the fact that ranked choice voting, adds some complexity, et cetera. So with regards to the vendors of software, hardware, what kind of, like ROI, or what kind of length of time are you seeing vendors actually investing in putting forward those products?
So the question was about vendors and return on investment, and do we see vendors working on this and providing this? And yes, but vendors are at work at it. I think part of the, without giving you a master class on federal certification of voting equipment, it's a tough thing for vendors to work on because they have to create a machine that's that they can sell in as many places in the country as possible, and because ranked choice voting is still not in wide use throughout the country, it's not a big return on investment for them. So another complication for them, of course, is that different communities have use different algorithms. Different kinds of ranked choice voting are in use in different communities across the country. So even if you say a vendor has a ranked choice voting capable equipment, well, does it run the algorithm for Massachusetts? Does it run the algorithm for Minneapolis? So it's a tough nut for vendors to crack. They are at work on it. So far, we've had some moderate success in working with our vendor to get them to provide this tool that we use that's sort of almost an aftermarket add-on that's not necessarily part of the federal certification suite that they go through, but that provides us that data file. And it's possible that we will have more expanded options available next time we go out for bid in 8 to 10 years, but it's hard to say.
And Loren, I would just add to that the equipment vendors from Hart, InterCivic to ES&S and others, Dominion and others, there are probably 4 main vendors. They are all now working on software solutions that are certified for use in states like Minnesota that required certified equipment and software. So that's in process. How quickly? It could be fairly soon, but that's not guaranteed. So that would be a process for St. Louis Park and other cities to explore.
So Ginny, can you speak about the distribution of spoiled ballots in recent RCV elections? Are they greater than in previous non-RCV?
Non-RCV elections, yes.
Thank you.
So before I answer, I just want to clarify what a spoiled ballot really is. A spoiled ballot is, this is where the voter has gone into the polling place, they've made a mistake on their ballot, and they actually ask for a replacement ballot. So every spoiled ballot actually represents a voter who knew that they made a mistake and got a new ballot. That said, yes, the number of spoiled ballots does go up. If you compare the most recent non-RCV election in Minneapolis, the spoiled ballot rate was about 1%. It went up to about 4%, and it's been consistent since then. So it quadruples, but the number was so kind of small to begin with, it's still relatively small. It does go up, but it's still small.
As an example, Precinct 7, general election, 2,500 people approximately voting, spoiled ballots, less than 1%. I'm just never seen it deviate.
And what we've seen as well in the research is that you pointed this out earlier, Loren, there are the election with the most spoiled ballots are the partisan primaries, where people don't understand going in that they can't vote across party lines and need to complete those ballots again. So that education's needed in those elections as well.
All right, we're now going to do one final question for everybody across the board. And so I guess if you want to just step across, that'll work for us. And the question is, what is one piece of advice you would give to an organization considering RCV? And if you don't have a comment, you don't have a comment.
Educate the voter and your personnel.
I would say the same thing.
I would not underestimate the amount of resources that you want to put into the administration piece, and the education has already been said. I'm not up here as a policy person, I'm up here as an administrator, and our goal obviously is to make sure that the election goes well no matter what system it is that you choose, and that does take resources.
My advice would be to learn from others who have already implemented it. And I hate to overuse the phrase, don't reinvent the wheel, but don't reinvent the wheel. Realize that we have at least 2 jurisdictions locally that know sort of the good, the bad, the ugly, et cetera, et cetera. Learn from that, and that'll decrease sort of your implementation costs and curves going forward.
And I guess I envision having a couple different models of a ballot that you would use in a test mode, and then from that build your education.
I would echo David's advice in terms of really learning from the existing experience, both incorporating what's already working well and not needing to repeat that work, but also learning from where some of the holes are in the education process. I think we know for the most part where education's working really well, and there are some exceptions, especially in the communities of color where the candidates are campaigning differently and not providing the adequate education, and we can hone and do better in those particular areas.
And I'd echo the education piece and just add to that your election judges are an invaluable resource for in-person voting, and to invest in a variety of modalities for that education. So I know in St. Paul we had in-person training, we had videos that are up on the website, and we also had some written materials as well that people could reference, and it was really helpful to have 3 different ways to learn that information, be able to review it because it was new and we wanted to be giving accurate information. So it was great to have different modalities to refer to.
Well, we're excuse me, we're closing in on 8 o'clock, so I don't want to keep people too terribly long, but I do want to give commissioners an opportunity if there was something that they wanted to ask that either was a follow-up to one of the questions or perhaps something that came up that you hadn't thought of previously. So I'll just kind of run down. Lynn, can you please step up to the microphone and ask your question? Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Jeanne, one of the things that we appear to be concerned about is the ease of doing ranked choice voting and the education around it. I'm looking at the information that you provided us about both the Minneapolis election findings and St. Paul. And because some people don't have these documents in front of them, we, for example, in St. Paul, we see 83% of the voters found RCV simple to use, yet only 72% of those voters said that they like it and they'd like to see it continue. So we're seeing an 11% dropout there. In Minneapolis, we see 92% found RCV simple and easy to use, but 84% of the voters said they like and they would want to continue. So we see a dropout of 8% there. Why do we think that we're seeing this happen in terms of, yeah, it's easy to use, but I don't like it? And are we going to continue to see this type of dropout happen in subsequent elections? Can you explain that?
Well, first I'll point out that both of these numbers are astoundingly high. Both of these numbers are astoundingly high. When we have voters in Minneapolis, 92% said it's simple to use, that's a pretty stellar number. It means the voter education between what the city has done and the grassroots community organizations have done has really worked and paid off. Plus, voters are more used to it. Then we ask voters, well, do you like and want to continue to use it? And for 84% to say yes to that, that means that the super vast majority want to continue to use that. Is there some drop-off? It looks like there has been, but we don't know for sure why that would be. What we do know is that voters often don't understand the old system, especially now that we've used ranked choice voting for a while. The old primary was super poorly attended. People didn't know it existed. When we educate voters about ranked choice voting and let them know why it has advantages in a local race, many don't know that they're really moving from a 2-round runoff, a primary and a general election, and then using ranking in one decisive election in November. So explaining that helps voters understand that. Who knows if some voters here would be familiar with what they'd be returning to if we reverted back to the old system, or if it would be something else. It's not clear. So I don't know, but what we do know is that these numbers are really high. 84% say, this is cool, this is great, we want to keep it, we don't want to go back.
Any other questions from commissioners? Actually, you can come up to this one if you'd like. Okay. Sorry.
Hi, I'm J.C. Beckstrand. For the benefit of the panel, I'm actually the individual that introduced the current optical scanning system 34 years ago to Hennepin County and the surrounding communities. So I was the one that asked the weighted, inclusive Gregory method. I still am very interested in the answer to that because I'm a firm believer in transparency, and so I'm a little bit confused, Ms. Gelms, how you said that it's important for people to understand the process by which these ballots are tabulated, and yet when I look at that, and I certainly understand it, it's I've read there's documents written by several professors out of Russia on that process. It's an interesting process, I grant that, but you know, that notwithstanding, it's something that I think is concerning to me. So we've heard a lot of great information about Minneapolis, St. Paul, and so forth, but at the same time, we really haven't had the problems that have necessarily demanded or called for ranked choice voting here in St. Louis Park. We're a relatively small community where we have challenges in even getting candidates to run. And so pluralities are generally not an issue for us. So I think for the members of the panel, you know, what is the problem that we're really trying to solve? I mean, for the city of St. Louis Park, is this something that, given the administrative burden, given the potential cost and so forth, that is truly worth implementing in the educational process that has to go along? I'm kind of wondering why here? And so I'm curious, I've heard from Ms. Brinkman, I've heard from Ms. Massey. I'm wondering from those of the rest of you, do you see it as a problem to be solved here versus a large community like Minneapolis or St. Paul? Professor Schultz, I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Okay, if I can start, I'll tell a story first. I'm from New York. I moved to Texas. I was the chapter president for the South Texas ACLU. One of the things that I learned a long time ago is what it means to be a carpetbagger. And what I mean by that is to never go in and tell another community what's best for them or what's wrong with their community. And the reason why I say that, at the end of the day, at one point in my discussion here, I mentioned something about the fact that ranked choice voting is a question of values at some point. And I think that's really where I would want to have the discussion to go here. And I think you framed it reasonably well, is that I know there may be some people who want to say that ranked choice voting is something for every community. And maybe that's true, but I think each community has to make decisions regarding their electoral systems and what works best for them. You know, in the same way that I would be hesitant to come into St. Louis Park and say that the best system for you should be, I don't know, a strong mayor with a city manager or something like that. I think communities have to decide what are the priorities, what is the most important things to them, you know, whether it's the transparency, whether it is forming majorities or coalitions, whatever like that. But the way I think about the world sometimes to say is that you start with what the problems that you have. What are the problems that you have that you want to solve, and what are the policy options that are available to be able to solve those problems? And so where I want to turn the question sort of back to you is to say that first, you know, I think as a charter commission, as a city, you need to decide what are the most important values that you want to secure in terms of your electoral system. And with that, and then ask the question, do you believe that ranked choice voting will be a way of being able to solve some of those problems and perhaps enhance some of the other values that you have? In many situations, I think ranked choice voting provides lots of powerful solutions to, and lots of, solves a lot of problems. But I also would be a fool to say, you know, in this, that ranked choice voting is the answer to everything. You know, that, you know, what's that old joke that says, give somebody a hammer and they think the whole world is a nail or something like that? So I want to put it back and say that I think part of the task of what a charter commission has to do, what a city council has to do, is to say, well, what are the issues that are important to us? What are the values that we have important? And do we think that ranked choice voting fits in with the range of solutions that we believe is important to good governance? This is not to be an elusive answer, but it's to really say at the end of the day that I don't believe there's any one correct answer for every community in which one system fits for everybody. I was going to say, I mean, last thing I'd say here, I don't know if any folks have ever heard of the National Civic League. The National Civic League creates about once every generation. It's gone back to the 1890s. They create about every 20 years a model city charter, you know, for operation. Teddy Roosevelt was the first chair of that. I like to tell people that about 15 years ago, I participated in the most recent version of that. Or the way I describe it is, it was a room full of some really smart people, and they asked me to show up too. And I say that because when we put together our model city charter, our recommendation for how cities should be governed, we didn't have one size fits all. We had about 5 or 6 or 7 different variations and models, and said that each community must make their own choice, what is important to them. And that's the message I want to leave you with.
Any additional questions from any of the commissioners?
Do we get to reply to
Oh,
this question?
please.
So I think it's a very valuable question, because I'm not participating in the government that actually has to use our revenue streams and decide how they're going to be expedited. From a philosophical, a political, or a civic perspective, if this system is offering the perception or the, in fact, capability of our citizens to feel like they can participate more fully, back a broader range of candidates, somebody that might speak to them or require the other candidates to speak to them versus just someone else, I think that's a valuable thing to contemplate, because that means we'll get more people thinking that and wanting to be involved. Back a candidate, or be willing to listen to other candidates and have other candidates understanding that to get to that majority, we can't just represent these people. We have to represent more people. And, you know, you will have to deal with the cost. But I think in the end, I agree. You have to decide what values you want to project. My understanding from St. Louis Park is they want inclusion and diversity. If that's the case, then we might want to give some serious consideration to a voting method that encourages those citizens to participate and the candidates to utilize to reach the broadest for a consensus.
Members of the commission, if I can add to that, I wanted to highlight how the conversation about ranked choice voting got started in St. Louis Park. At the time when there was a conversation about eliminating the primary, people in the community were calling FairVote Minnesota saying, well, could we use ranked choice voting if the primary was not going to exist anymore? Could we use a ranked ballot in November? So it was the decision to eliminate the primary that prompted the conversation in the first place, because it wasn't eliminate and replace, it was simply to eliminate. So by solving one problem, getting rid of the low turnout primary, another was potentially created by allowing for plurality, not majority outcomes in November. What we did then was went back to look at, well, how many races were competitive? What would be the demand and the need in a community like St. Louis Park for a more robust system like ranked choice voting to ensure candidates won with a majority of the vote? So looking at the numbers, we look not too far back in 2017, the Ward 1 race had 4 candidates. The primary resulted in not a majority winner, so that's one example where ranked choice voting definitely would have been useful to ensure a majority winner, if that's the goal of the community, in November under ranked choice voting. from 2009 through 2017, there's been at least one race where the primary had 3 or more candidates running that would have invoked really the ranked choice voting process if that was a general election contest. So I wanted to just point those numbers out and remind people about what initiated this conversation in the first place.
Thank you. And I just wanted to make a comment because we were talking about how you're talking to just a specific group of people versus all of the people. Just a reminder that our city council elections are nonpartisan. So we are speaking to the entire city. So I just wanted to make sure that that point was made. And any other questions from commissioners? Please, can you come up to the microphone, JC?
I think from an education process, this has been extraordinarily helpful, and I'd like to thank everybody. I know you've all taken time away from your evenings. I was one of the individuals that asked to have kind of an expert Q&A panel so that we could try to weigh some of the pros and cons, some of the anecdotes and the subjectivities from some of the objective information and so forth. And so for myself, this has been incredibly helpful, and I appreciate everybody's time and their honesty and being forthright. There it is. Yeah. I usually project well enough anyways. But anyways, I would like to thank everybody for their time. I really think this was very helpful. It was especially helpful for me, I know. One of the challenges that I've had in sitting on the commission because of my prior experience is getting down into the technical weeds while coming back up to talk about the very thing that Professor Schultz talked about, and that is what are the values that we as a community are trying to demonstrate, and the difference between governance at that particular level and policy making versus implementation and tactical efforts around an issue. So thank you.
All right, I would echo JC's comments. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It was very important that we did this, not only for the people in the room here tonight, but to educate people throughout St. Louis Park about what the opportunities and challenges might be with ranked choice voting. So again, thanks for taking the time. And if we have any follow-up questions, are we welcome to contact you? I'm seeing nods. So thank you very much. And with that, I think I will close the meeting. Thanks to all of you for inviting us.
Thank you.